It was Game 5 of the 1997 NBA Finals. The Chicago Bulls were facing the Utah Jazz, and Michael Jordan had spent the entire previous night curled up on the bathroom floor of his hotel room in Salt Lake City, unable to move, unable to eat, barely able to breathe. His personal trainer, Tim Grover, sat outside the door listening to him suffer. The team doctors weren't sure he would play. Jerry Krause, the Bulls' general manager, had already started preparing the organization for the possibility that the greatest player in the world would have to sit out the most important game of the season. And then the Jazz, sensing an opportunity, did something that crossed a line nobody should ever cross. They leaked it, not officially, not through a press release, but through whispers, through sources, through the kind of calculated cruelty that only happens when someone smells blood in the water. By morning, the story was everywhere. Michael Jordan was sick. Michael Jordan was weak. Michael Jordan shouldn't even be playing. And somewhere in that hotel room, lying in a cold sweat, with his legs barely able to hold his own weight, Michael Jordan heard every single word of it. What happened over the next 24 hours became one of the most extraordinary performances in the history of professional sports. But to understand why it meant what it meant, you have to go back further. You have to understand what was really at stake. And you have to understand the specific kind of pressure that was sitting on Jordan's shoulders that night in Salt Lake City. Because this wasn't just about a basketball game. It never was. By 1997, Michael Jordan had already won 4 championships. He had already redefined what it meant to be a professional athlete. He had already become something beyond basketball, something beyond sport, something that existed in a category that only had one member. But 1997 was different, because 1997 was the year the doubt started creeping back in. Not publicly. Nobody was brave enough to doubt Jordan publicly. But in the private conversations, in the locker rooms of other teams, in the offices of general managers and coaches across the league, there was a quiet, dangerous whisper. Jordan was 34 years old. He had come back from a year and a half of retirement. His body was different. The game was changing. The Jazz were physical, brutal, disciplined. Karl Malone was the reigning MVP. John Stockton was the greatest point guard of his generation. Phil Jackson was telling the press that this was the hardest finals the Bulls had faced. And now Jordan was sick. Now Jordan was human. And the people who had been keeping those whispers quiet finally let them out. They said he shouldn't even be playing. They said putting him on that court would embarrass him. They said the Jazz would expose him, that his body would betray him, that the story of Game 5 would be the story of how Michael Jordan finally ran out of magic. They were wrong. But they were wrong in a way that nobody could have predicted, and the reason they were wrong tells you everything you need to know about who Michael Jordan actually was. Tim Grover tells the story better than anyone. He was there for all of it, the only person Jordan allowed to see him at his lowest point that night. Jordan had eaten a pizza that had been delivered to his hotel room by 5 men, which Grover has always found suspicious, though nothing was ever proven. What is certain is that somewhere around midnight, Jordan became violently ill. He was dehydrated, exhausted, shaking. The team physician, Dr. John Hefferon, was called. His assessment was blunt. Jordan was severely ill. His body was not in any condition to play 48 minutes of NBA Finals basketball against the best team in the Western Conference. The recommendation was rest. The recommendation was to protect him, to preserve him for Game 6. To make the smart, rational, medically sound decision. Jordan listened to all of it. And then he said something that Grover never forgot. He said, "I'm playing. Not I think I can play. Not I'll try. I'm playing." That was the end of the conversation. What nobody knows, what the cameras never captured, what the commentary didn't have access to, is what happened in the locker room before tip-off. Jordan had barely slept. He had spent hours unable to keep anything down. His legs were unsteady. Scottie Pippen, who had played alongside Jordan for years and understood him better than almost anyone, looked at him in the locker room and felt something he had never felt before watching Jordan prepare for a game. He felt afraid, not for the Bulls, not for the series, but for Jordan himself. He looked at his teammate and thought, this man should not be on this floor tonight. And then Jordan looked back at him, and Pippen stopped thinking that. Because Jordan's eyes were different. They were the eyes of a man who had already decided. Not just decided to play, decided to win. Decided to make every single person who had whispered that he was finished, who had let the story leak, who had said he shouldn't even be playing, pay for every single word. Pippen had seen that look before. He had seen it directed at opponents, at referees, at the entire city of Cleveland on certain nights in April. But he had never seen it burn quite this hot, and he understood immediately that whatever was about to happen on that court, it was going to be something people talked about for the rest of their lives. The game started and Jordan was visibly struggling. The television cameras caught him bent over with his hands on his knees during timeouts. His face was pale. His movements were slightly slower than normal, slightly more deliberate, as if every step required a decision. The commentators noticed. The Jazz players noticed. Karl Malone, to his credit, has said since that he saw Jordan that night and genuinely worried about him. That he told his teammates before the game that if Jordan was truly sick, they needed to end it quickly. They needed to be ruthless. They needed to show him no mercy, because showing mercy to Michael Jordan was the most dangerous thing you could do. Malone was right about the last part, because here is what happened. Jordan didn't pretend to be healthy. He didn't try to hide that he was suffering. He was suffering visibly, in front of 20,000 people and millions watching at home, and he used it. He used every grimace, every unsteady moment, every visible sign of struggle as fuel for something that was building inside him with every passing minute. By the second quarter, the Bulls were down. The Jazz were in control. And then Jordan did what Jordan did. He started scoring. Not dramatically, not on dunks or spectacular plays. He started scoring the way a man who knows exactly what he's doing scores when he has almost nothing left in his body. He was conserving everything. Every movement was precise. Every shot was calculated. There was no wasted motion, no energy spent on performance. It was pure, cold, surgical basketball from a man who had decided that his body's limitations were simply irrelevant to the outcome he had already determined. By halftime, he had 15 points. The Bulls were still in the game. In the locker room, Jordan sat apart from everyone. He didn't speak much. Grover was with him, making sure he stayed hydrated, watching his color, checking his steadiness. Jordan's eyes were closed. He was inside himself somewhere, in whatever place champions go when the world is asking too much of them, and they decide to give it anyway. Phil Jackson came over and said something quietly, and Jordan nodded. That was the entire conversation. In the second half, something shifted. The Jazz could feel it, even if they couldn't explain it. Jordan started attacking differently. He started taking the game over in the specific way that only happens when a player has stopped trying to manage a situation and started trying to destroy it. The crowd, which had been hostile all night, began to shift. The Jazz fans, the most passionate home fans in the league, started to sense that something was happening that they were powerless to stop. The shot that everyone remembers came with 25 seconds left and the Bulls trailing by 1. Jordan received the ball at the top of the key, pump-faked Brian Russell into the air, stepped back, and released a three-pointer that seemed to hang in the air for an impossibly long time before dropping through the net. Bulls by 1. The arena went silent in the specific way that arenas go silent when the home crowd realizes they have just watched something irreversible happen. Jordan didn't celebrate. He pumped his fist once, quietly to himself, and turned to get back on defense. It was not a performance for the crowd. It was not a gesture for the cameras. It was a private acknowledgement between himself and the game he had just bent to his will one more time. In the locker room after the game, Jordan sat on the floor in the corner for several minutes before he could stand up to shower. His body had finally stopped cooperating entirely. Grover was there, Pippen was there, and a few teammates who understood that what they had just witnessed required a certain kind of silence. Jordan didn't make a speech. He didn't deliver a line for the cameras. He sat on the floor and breathed. And then he looked up at Pippen and said something that has been repeated so many times since that it has almost lost its weight. But in that moment, in that locker room, it carried the full force of everything that had happened over the previous 24 hours. He said, "I wasn't going to let us lose." That was it. Not I was determined to win. Not I gave it everything I had. I wasn't going to let us lose. The distinction matters. It tells you exactly how Jordan's mind worked, what the game looked like from inside his perspective. It wasn't about what he could do. It was about what he was refusing to allow. The Jazz won Game 6 and forced a Game 7. Then the Bulls won Game 7 and took the championship. But the series is remembered for Game 5. The series is remembered for a photograph of Michael Jordan being carried off the court by Scottie Pippen, his head resting on his teammate's shoulder, his body finally acknowledging what everyone had known since the night before. The series is remembered because of what it revealed about the specific architecture of greatness, about what separates the people who perform at the highest level from the people who merely perform very well. The difference is not talent. Talent is the table stakes. The difference is what happens inside a person when the conditions are worst, when the body is failing, when the people watching have already decided the outcome, when everything rational and reasonable is pointing toward surrender. The difference is what Jordan showed in Salt Lake City. The difference is the decision that gets made in a hotel room at midnight when nobody is watching, when there is no crowd to perform for, when it would be completely understandable and even advisable to stay in bed. I'm playing. That decision. That's where greatness actually lives. What happened to the people who leaked the story, who whispered that he shouldn't be playing, who thought they were watching the beginning of the end? They watched Game 5 happen. They watched 38 points happen. They watched that photograph happen. And they learned, the way everyone who underestimates extraordinary people eventually learns, that the story you tell about someone's limitations is always less powerful than the story they tell about themselves. Jordan's body told one story that night. His will told another, and his will won. Not metaphorically, not in a way that required interpretation or generous framing. His will physically overcame what his body was telling him was impossible, and it did it in front of the world, documented in every statistic and preserved in every frame of footage from that night, and it will be true forever. There is a photograph that lives somewhere between sport and mythology now. Jordan, barely upright, arm around Pippen's neck, being walked off the floor of the Delta Center in Salt Lake City after one of the greatest performances anyone has ever produced under those circumstances. His eyes are half closed, his body is completely depleted, and on his face, if you look closely, past the exhaustion, past the physical cost of everything he just did, there is something that has no name in English, but that every person who has ever fought through something they shouldn't have survived can recognize instantly. It is not pride. It is not relief. It is the specific quiet that settles over a person when they have just proved to themselves and to everyone watching that the doubt was wrong, that the whispers were wrong, that the people who said he shouldn't even be playing were more wrong than they had any right to be. He was carried off the court like a king, because that is what kings do. They don't wait for the conditions to be right. They don't ask for permission to compete when their body is failing them. They make the decision in the dark, when nobody can see them, when it would cost them nothing to choose differently, and then they walk out onto the floor and they show you who they are. Michael Jordan showed you who he was on June 11, 1997, in Salt Lake City, Utah, on 38 points and a stomach he could barely keep settled, against the best team he had faced in years, while the people who doubted him watched every second of it and understood, too late, that they had made the mistake of thinking he was capable of doing anything other than winning. The Bulls won the championship 5 days later. But the moment that defined that season, the moment that people still talk about, the moment that gets passed from father to child in conversations about what it looks like to be truly great, happened in Game 5. It happened in a hotel room at midnight when a decision got made. It happened on a basketball court when 38 points came from a body that had nothing left to give. And it happened in a photograph of a man being carried off the floor, completely spent, completely victorious, having given the only answer that ever actually matters to the people who say you shouldn't even be playing.